The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Healthcare.gov, Consequences of Stolen Identity. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement and then the ranking member. When the Obama administration launched Healthcare.gov, Americans were led to believe that the website was safe and secure. As the Science, Space, and Technology Committee learned at our hearing last November, this was simply not the case. We heard troubling testimony from online security experts who highlighted the many vulnerabilities of the Obama website. These flaws pose significant risk to Americans' privacy and the security of their personal information. One witness, Mr. David Kennedy, who has been reinvited for today's hearing, testified that there are, quote, clear indicators that even basic security was not built into the Healthcare.gov website, end quote. In addition, all four experts testified that the website is not secure and should not have been launched. Mr. Kennedy will update the committee on the security of the website since November 30th, which was the administration's self-imposed deadline for when it would be fixed. Since the November hearing, other events have emerged that prompted the need for today's hearing. In December, a former senior security expert at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services stated that she recommended against launching the Healthcare.gov website on October 1st because of, quote, high-risk security concerns. A letter addressed to the committee from Mr. Kennedy and independently signed by 7 other security researchers who reviewed his analysis of vulnerabilities presents some very troubling information. To paraphrase one of the experts, Mr. Kevin Mitnick, who was once the world's most wanted hacker, breaking into Healthcare.gov and potentially gaining access to the information stored in these databases would be a hacker's dream. According to Mr. Mitnick, a breach may result in massive identity theft never seen before. Without objection, Mr. Kennedy's letter will be made a part of the record. Further, a recent report by the Credit Bureau and consumer data tracking service Experian forecast an increase in data breaches in 2014, particularly in the healthcare industry. Specifically, the report states, quote, the healthcare industry by far will be the most susceptible to publicly disclosed and widely scrutinized data breaches in 2014. Add to that the healthcare insurance exchanges, which are slated to add 7 million people into the healthcare system, and it becomes clear that the industry, from local physicians to large hospital networks, provide an expanded attack surface for breaches, end quote. Experian provides the identity verification component of the health insurance marketplace enrollment process. Because of increased accessibility to Healthcare.gov, concerns continue to grow about the security of personal information. The work of this committee will help Congress make decisions about what actions may be necessary to further inform and safeguard the American people. We are here today to discuss whether the Americans who have signed up for health care plans have put their personal information at risk. If Americans' information is not secure, then the theft of their identities is inevitable and dangerous. That concludes my opening statement, and the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for hers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Since we held our November 19th hearing highlighting security issues at Healthcare.gov, up to 110 million people have had their debit cards or credit card information compromised by a hack of Target store records. But Target was not alone in being successfully hacked. The Washington Post, Facebook, Gmail, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, Yahoo, JP Morgan Chase, Snapchat, and my friends at Dallas-based Neiman Marcus stores have announced security breaches. However, do you know one system that has not been successfully hacked since the last hearing? Healthcare.gov. Also, since the last hearing, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, staff and contractors have been working around the clock to improve the performance and security of Healthcare.gov. There's been numerous fixes to the website that have improved the site's responsiveness compared to its first 60 days. Millions of Americans have been able to access the site and obtain medical coverage. During that entire time, top security contractors, including Blue Canopy, Frontier Security, and the MITRE Corporation, have been working to test the system and identify weaknesses that need to be addressed. The Chief Information Security Officer has also been running weekly penetration tests to support security mitigation steps for CMS. Further, CMS says that none of the majority's witnesses' concerns voiced in that November hearing have turned into any actual breach of security. The last hearing did not feature a single witness who had any actual information about the security architecture of Healthcare.gov, nor what is being done to maintain the integrity of the website. Today we have the same kind of hearing. As smart and experienced as these witnesses are, not one of them has actual knowledge of security structure at Healthcare.gov. The best that they can do is speculate about vulnerabilities. I think it would be good for members to remember that. I'm concerned that the intentions in this hearing appears to be to scare Americans away from Healthcare.gov site. This appears to present a continuation of a cynical campaign to make the Affordable Care Act fail through lack of participation. While we are holding this hearing, both the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee are holding similar events, all with the apparent goal to create a sense of fear, thereby manufacturing an artificial security crisis. It is my hope that all of our witnesses can agree that it is important to make Healthcare.gov work for the American people, to help give all of our citizens access to affordable health care. I do not want to believe that any of the witnesses testifying today want the site to be hacked or shut down, or even see the program fail, or see Americans go without health care insurance. This country faces a lot of real issues and real policy challenges. If we are truly interested in hacking and identity theft, we should have representatives of the largest retail institutions in the country here to discuss the challenges they face in protecting people's information. Instead, it appears that the majority has allowed the committee to become a tool of a political messaging to a degree, and I've never witnessed any time in my time in Congress, and I'm in my 22nd year. Thank you. I hope that the committee hearing will be last of this topic, absent some actual allegations of wrongdoing, and so that we can focus on legitimate oversight issues facing the country in this committee. Mr. Chairman, before I yield, I would also like to comment on the letter you want to put in the record. I was hoping, after reading it, that you would have some testimony or give the people opportunity other than a 24-hour showing of this letter. But you don't have to take my word on this. Mr. Kennedy's own document reads, this report is for public use. The report is not appended to his testimony, and I imagine it is not added because it would violate our 48-hour rule. He did not get us testimony in time, but when late yesterday afternoon presented this report out of the blue. And I'm guessing your counsel told him to make it a letter because we routinely accept outside letters from groups and experts all the time with minimal notice. So the report now pretends to be a letter addressed to you and to me. However, I cannot remember another time when a witness for the committee also felt they had to write us a letter. I think it is an elaborate way to try to get testimony before the committee in violation of the 48-hour rule. As the substance of the report, it includes what amounts to testimony from experts who are not appearing before us. This committee is against the practice of the committee to accept testimony from people who are not personally available to answer our questions. The one thing I do know is that none of the individuals who signed these statements in the packet have worked on Healthcare.gov or the security protocols behind the website. In other words, they know no more about the actual security of the site than does Mr. Kennedy. In deference to the chairman, I will withdraw my objection, but I would point out that this report includes language that I consider vulgar and beneath the dignity of the committee. That alone should be reason to keep it out. Even if the chairman is comfortable with the way our rules are being stretched, if you insist, I will withdraw, but I want the record to reflect that we've gone beyond professional behavior of this committee. Thank you.
I'll recognize myself to respond to the ranking member's comments. All committees, including this one, have a long-standing practice of affording members the courtesy of entering items that they believe are relevant to the topic at hand into the record. I'm sure the ranking member knows this. Members on both sides have generally approached the development of the record in a spirit of bipartisanship and comedy. I am disappointed that the gentlewoman from Texas would now seek to question a letter I've asked to place in the record. We frequently place items in the record that express the opinion of various groups or make statements regarding an issue at the request of members on both sides of the aisle. Often, those who have written those letters are not testifying before the committee and have not been asked to do so, yet their opinions are still made part of the record. One such example is a 54-page submission that Mr. Maffei requested be placed in the record at a hearing last August. This document, which was not even addressed to the committee, but instead to the administrator of the EPA, was entered into the record without comment. It includes a letter from 6 different Indian tribes signed by 8 different people, none of whom testified before this committee. It includes a letter from the lawyer who represented the tribes. He also did not testify before the committee, yet we made his letter a part of the record. Finally, it includes another letter to the administrator of the EPA that purports to be from 15 different national organizations, 17 international organizations, 75 Alaskan organizations, and numerous other organizations from other states. None of these organizations testified before this committee. I have placed Mr. Kennedy's letter in the record here today. He is testifying before us shortly,
Mr. Chairman.
and members will have the opportunity to question him on its content.
Mr. Chairman.
I'm still in the middle of my statement. I regret the ranking member has questioned the long-standing prerogative of a member to enter a relevant document into the record, especially when members on her side of the aisle have done so many times without objection from the majority. I hope this is not indicative of her desire to make this committee's business more partisan. That concludes my statement, and I will now introduce the witnesses.
Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to introduce the witnesses, and that the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, I object to the entry of the letter into the record.
And the letter has already been entered into the record, and the objection is not timely.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask for a vote on whether we enter the letter into the record.
That is no longer a proper motion because it is not timely.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think you have deeply politicized this hearing.
Well, I'm sorry for the ranking member's comments that caused it, and now I'll recognize and introduce our first witness. Mr. David Kennedy is the president and CEO of Trusted Sec, LLC. Mr. Kennedy is considered a leader in the security field. He has spoken at many conferences worldwide, including Black Hat, DEF CON, InfoSec World, and the Information Security Summit, among others. Prior to moving to the private sector, Mr. Kennedy worked for the National Security Agency and the United States Marines in cyber warfare and forensics analysis. Mr. Kennedy received his bachelor's degree from Malone University. Our second witness, Mr. Waylon Krush, is the co-founder and CEO of LunarLine. He is also a founding member of the Warrior to Cyber Warrior program, a free 6-month cybersecurity boot camp for returning veterans. A veteran of the U.S. Army, Mr. Krush is a recipient of the Knowlton Award, one of the highest honors in the field of intelligence. Mr. Krush holds a bachelor's degree in computer information science from the University of Maryland, University College. He is also a certified information systems security professional, certification and accreditation professional, certified information systems auditor, and has more than 3,000 hours of training with the National Cryptologic School. Our third witness, Mr. Michael Grigg, is a CEO of Superior Solutions, Inc., an IT security consulting firm. Mr. Gregg's organization performs security assessments and penetration testing for Fortune 1000 firms. He's published over a dozen books on IT security and is a well-known security trainer and speaker. Mr. Grigg is frequently cited by print publications as a cybersecurity expert and as an expert commentator for network broadcast outlets such as Fox, CBS, NBC, ABC, and CNBC. Mr. Grigg holds 2 associate's degrees, a bachelor's degree, and a master's degree. Our final witness, Dr. Larry Poneman, is the chairman and founder of the Poneman Institute, a research think tank dedicated to advancing privacy, data protection, and information security practices. Dr. Poneman is considered a pioneer in privacy auditing and was named by Security Magazine as one of the most influential people for security. Dr. Poneman consults with leading multinational organizations on global privacy management programs. He has extensive knowledge of regulatory frameworks for managing privacy, data protection, and cybersecurity, including financial services, healthcare, pharmaceutical, telecom, and internet. Dr. Poneman earns his master's degree from Harvard University and his PhD at Union College in Schenectady, New York. He also attended the doctoral program in systems sciences at Carnegie Mellon University. We welcome you all, look forward to your expert testimony, and Mr. Kennedy, will you lead us off?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to everybody in the House Science and Technology Committee, to the Honorable Mr. Smith, as well as the ranking member of the House and Science and Technology Committee, the Honorable Ms. Johnson. It's great to see you two folks again, as well as all of the other ranking members here today. I appreciate your time to hear us discuss the issues with the Healthcare.gov security concerns, as well as the consequences around stolen identities. What I want to first start off with is that, to me, this is not a political issue. I take no political party stance. I have no party affiliate. For me personally, this is a security issue. Working in the security industry for over 14 years, including working for the National Security Agency, as well as spending a number of years in Iraq and Afghanistan, my testimony here today is to talk about the issues with security, and that's it. So when I talk about the issues that we see here today, it's based on my expertise of working in the security industry, doing these assessments on a regular basis, being a chief security officer for a Fortune 1000 company for a number of years, as well as running my own company. And I'm not alone. The mention of the document that was released yesterday had 7 independent security researchers that are well known in the security industry, including a number of folks that have worked for the United States government, do training for the United States government, as well as work closely with the United States government. Today is not to talk about the political party problems with it, but also discuss just the security issues alone. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. So I'd like to give a thanks to Kevin Mitnick, Ed Scotus, Chris Nickerson, Chris Gates, Eric Smith, John Strand, and Kevin Johnson for providing their testimony on, or their comments on the issues that we see today. And we were pretty unified in our approach. Everybody that I shared with, I put them under non-disclosure agreements and worked with them, and the consistent feedback that we got was that Healthcare.gov is not secure today. And nothing's really changed since the November 19th testimony. In fact, from our November 19th testimony, it's even worse. Additional security researchers have come into play, providing additional research, additional findings that we can definitely tell that the website is not getting any better. In fact, since the November 19th, 2013 testimony, there's only been 1/2 of a vulnerability that we discovered that has been addressed or even closely to being mitigated. And what I say about 1/2 is that basically they did a little bit of work on it, and it's still vulnerable today. I want to throw a disclaimer out there that in no way, shape, or form do we perform any type of hacking on the website. That's a misnomer. The type of techniques that we use is looking at the site from a health perspective, doing what we call passive reconnaissance, not attacking the site in any way, shape, or form, not sending data to the site, but really looking at the health of it. I'd like to put it in another analogy. Say my expertise wasn't being in the security industry. It wasn't anywhere near doing anything security related. And I was a person that was a mechanic. I had 14 years of being a mechanic. And a car drove past me that was puffing blue smoke out of the muffler. It was leaking oil. The engine was making clanking sounds. And, basically a lot of symptomatic problems. The doors are open, the windows are open, everything else. As a mechanic, I can probably say with a reasonable level of assurance that the engine probably has some issues. Same thing with technology and web applications. Web applications are no different than a car with an engine problem. There's a lot of pieces that make the car work. There's a lot of pieces that make a website work. From our testimony here today, as well as what we've discovered in the previous past, there's a number of security issues that are still there today with the website. And to put it in perspective, I'd like to put for the record that there wasn't 70 to 110 million credit cards taken from Target. That's not accurate. The correct statistic is that there were 70 to 110 million personal pieces of information taken about individual people that shopped at Target. There was 40 million credit cards that were taken. The issue with Target isn't specifically around credit cards. Credit cards can be reissued. Personal your credit that gets taken from the credit cards can be debited back into your account. You're not liable as a consumer. But what you can't fix is your personal identity. If you look at Target, for example, the 70 to 110 million personal pieces of information, that includes address, email addresses, phone numbers, additional information. That's what you can't replace. And we've already seen a number of individuals that are selectively being targeted from a personal information perspective because of that. That doesn't even include Social Security numbers. In fact, I just had another independent security person get targeted yesterday from an email claiming to be Target. As soon as they clicked the link, it hacked their computer and took full control of it. So this issue here doesn't relate specifically to just credit card data, because that's obviously not on the Healthcare.gov website. The personal information around Social Security numbers, first name, last name, email addresses, home of record, those are all a recipe for disaster when it comes to what we see from personal information being stolen and theft. So it's not just that. As an attacker, if I had access to the Healthcare.gov infrastructure, it has direct integration into the IRS, DHS, as well as third-party providers as well for credit checks. If I have access to those government agencies, I now can complete an entire online profile of an individual, everything that they do, and all their entire online presence. And this isn't just Healthcare.gov that alone. I'm not trying to single out Healthcare.gov alone. I'm really focusing on a much larger issue, which is security in the federal government alone is at a really bad state. We need to really work together to fix it and work on more sweeping changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Krusch.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on an important topic of cybersecurity. I'm Waylon Krusch, founder and CEO of Lunarline. We're one of the fastest growing cybersecurity companies. I'm also a founder of the Warrior to Cyber Warrior program, as stated earlier. I've been asked to speak on cybersecurity today as it relates to Healthcare.gov, and just listen to Mr. Kennedy. I actually have some very simple points I want to make right away. First of all, if none of us here built Healthcare.gov, if we're not actively doing not a passive vulnerability assessment, but an active vulnerability assessment and doing penetrations and running that exploitable code on Healthcare.gov, we can only speculate whether or not those attacks will work. So anything that's been said thus far, if we're talking about any type of .gov or .mil site, just identifying passively a vulnerability and not actually working on the site, knowing how the protocols work in the back end, what type of defense in depth, how each one of the assets are locked down, nobody here at this table can tell you that they know that there's vulnerabilities. Another thing I would like to talk about today is in the federal government, something a little bit different than we have in the commercial organizations is we use something called the risk management framework. And, this committee has actually helped develop that as part of NIST. And I will tell you, that is one of the most rigorous processes as it relates to cybersecurity and privacy in the entire world. And when I say the entire world, most security standards are just a subset of the risk management framework. It's one of those areas from a security control perspective that has been taken to build other security standards, or it's basically copy-cut pasted to create new security standards. This is a 6-step process. It includes a categorization, selection, implementation, validation, authorization, and most importantly, continuous monitoring of all the controls. Just looking at it, you might think, well, there's about 360 controls in this special publication 853 revision 4. When you dig a little bit deeper, there's actually several thousand information security controls that our federal information systems must undergo from a security architecture perspective, including they must be continuously testing. Another point I would like to make is that if anybody here is actually went out to these websites, and I'm not talking about passive, but if we've extracted addresses, if you went to the website and done anything outside the bounds of what's allowed in the federal government, you're basically breaking the law. You can't just go out and say, I found this vulnerability, and then exploit it to try to get media attention or anything like that. If you do that, you're breaking the law. It's pretty simple. And last and not least, Healthcare.gov is one of many hundreds or even thousands of federal information systems out there and websites. And I've worked in the threat area. I can tell you my background is not only a soldier that was on the U.S. Army's information operations red teams, blue teams, information system security monitoring teams, protocol analysis, signals analysis, and including working in critical infrastructure protection for AT&T for a few years all across the world. if you go out and tell someone, and this is just the truth when we're out actively taking down websites, I can sit here all day and speculate about a vulnerability. But until I've actually exploited that vulnerability, there is no way to tell whether that attack will actually work. There's a lot more going on in the background that everybody needs to understand. Another note, and last but not least, about Healthcare.gov that everyone needs to understand is that with all of the media attention it's currently getting, you would think it's the most high payoff target in the entire federal government. You would think that Healthcare.gov is something that everybody would want to go after. And that's truly just not, that's media spin, if anything. Healthcare.gov is one of many websites that has personal information in it. It's connected to other systems, but saying it's interconnected directly to all these systems and that leaves them vulnerable is also shows kind of a lack of knowledge of the back-end system capabilities, meaning that those connections are very secure and they're authorized on both sides. And, you know, I have actually been lucky enough to work within CMS and HHS on cybersecurity deployments and configurations. So out of everybody here, at least at this table, I probably have the most hands-on knowledge. But I can't come here and just speculate about what is actual vulnerable to the system and what is not. And the truth is, once again on the threat side, as we've seen in media, you can probably tell that, you know, Healthcare.gov is not the one getting attacked. Most cyber criminals, and especially those with advanced capabilities, they go where the money is, right? They're going to go after the targets. They're going to go after the Neiman Marcus. They're going to go after these places that contain lots of data related to intellectual property because it just makes fiscal sense, right? If the U.S. government spends billions of dollars on our research and development and we don't protect it and some other country takes that, you just save them billions of dollars. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cruz. Mr. Grigg.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Yeah. Thank you, Ranking Member Johnson, members of the committee for having me here today. Again, my name is Michael Grigg. I'm really going to break down my speech into three pieces in my presentation. First, how Healthcare.gov could potentially be hacked, why Healthcare.gov needs independent review by third parties, and also what would be the result of this, what could be the potential impact. My concern is that Healthcare.gov is a major target potentially for hackers looking to steal not only personal identities but also information that could be used to steal their identity. Although I understand Healthcare.gov does not store that information, it passes that information back and forth between third-party government sites and other organizations. While there's many different ways that that site could be hacked, there are some prominent ones, and these are the same ones listed by prominent websites like OWASP. It could be things like cross-site scripting, SQL injection, it could be LDAP injection, it could be buffer overflows. There's many different ways that this could be done. Now, while that sounds foreign to many of you, the fact is these are known attacks that are used against known sites every day, from Target to Neiman Marcus to Google to many others. Some of the things that concerns me are in the past we've seen, for example, the 834 data. That's data that's passed to the back end of the insurance companies. We've seen and we've heard reports of this information being corrupted and not being correct when it's being received. That indicates at some point the data is not being handled correctly. And all input data, all process data, all output data has to be correct. If not, there's some type of problem, meaning that data is not being properly parsed. That same type of situation could lead to an attacker putting in some type of data and misusing that in some way or launching an attack. Also, as I said, Healthcare.gov is a very large attack surface. This is a very large programmer application. It was built very quickly. A large attack surface makes it very hard to secure. So I find it hard to believe that during the release and also the update of the site that all the items that our previous speaker spoke of, as far as FSMA, FIPS 199, FIPS 200, that those things were actually taken care of and it actually passed all those requirements that they're required to by law, and that those were properly completed. Microsoft, think of those folks, for example. They've spent almost 30 years trying to secure their operating systems, and still we see Microsoft products, their operating systems being brought under attack. To think that Healthcare.gov could be built so quickly and then be secured, to me, is very hard to believe. When we have a large application or website to be reviewed, typically we do it in a couple of different ways. We start at the very beginning before the site is actually developed. We do things as far as audits. We do vulnerability assessments. We also do pen testing. All three of these things are required to actually look at and examine the site. Pen testing is a very important part of this process because pen testing means we're looking at the site the same way the attacker would. We're saying, what would the attacker see? What could they use? What could they do with this, and how could they leverage this potentially for attack? I don't believe those types of assessments have been done to this day and have been properly completed. So what's been reported currently is that when we see with Healthcare.gov that they are running weekly assessments, that they are potentially patching the site. But a lot of that activity we're talking about is reactive in nature. That means when we're finding a problem, we're actually fixing it. That doesn't mean we've already gone out and we found all possible problems or all potential ways that an attacker may leverage that and get access to the site. Some might argue that if Healthcare.gov is actually vulnerable, why hasn't it already been attacked? Well, if you think about it from an attacker standpoint, we've seen that attackers have the fortitude, also the patience to wait till the right time. Look at Target. Did they attack immediately? No. They waited till the right time and the right moment to actually do this. This could be the same thing. They're going to wait till after March. They're going to wait till the deadline. They're going to wait till there's a trove of information for them to go after. Then they're going to target it. So what could be the impact on consumers? Potentially reduced credit ratings. It could be increased difficulty getting loans. It could be criminal issues. It could be emotional impact. It also could be very damaging as far as medical information that could be lost. Could be potentially people don't get hired for a job. It could be they get the wrong treatment because someone else has obtained treatment under their name for some other type of disease or some other type of problem that they didn't have. It could be potentially them being denied an application or job for some reason. And in closing, I'd just like to say this. When my organization builds applications, we bring everybody together. We bring the end users, the developers, we bring everyone together, the security professionals, to make sure the site is secure and that security can be built in from the very beginning. I do not believe that that's been done in this case. Hacking today is big business. It's no longer the lone hacker, the individual in their basement. Today it's organized crime. It's very large groups, potentially out of places like Russia and Eastern Europe. We can fix these problems, but for these problems to be fixed means that we need an external assessment of this site by independent third parties. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Grigg and Dr. Perlman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for inviting me. Well, first, let me just start off by saying that I am the research wonk to this panel. These people are absolutely brilliant. They understand the technical aspects and the security issues. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the consequences of identity theft and medical identity theft. That's really my focus. And the basis of my comments is research that my institute conducts. And sometimes, by the way, they call my institute the Pokemon Institute. It's actually Poneman Institute, which is my last name. So I understand the purpose of my testimony today is to provide assistance in understanding the potentially devastating consequences of a data breach to individuals, to households, and society as a whole. For more than a decade, we have studied the costs and consequences of data breach through extensive consumer studies, as well as benchmark research on the privacy and data protection practices of companies in the private and public sectors. In the area of healthcare, we have conducted 4 annual studies on medical identity theft and patient privacy and security protections within hospitals and clinics. We also survey consumers on their perceptions about the organizations they trust or they trust the most to protect their privacy. Among U.S. federal government sector, for example, we are pleased to report some good news that the USPS, the Postal Service, gets very high marks for trust. Another, this might be a little surprising, the IRS actually is trusted for privacy. Not for anything else, no, I'm just joking, but definitely for privacy practices, as well as the Veterans Administration, and they were a bad guy, right? You might remember they lost a lot of data. I'm a veteran. I was on that, the list of 26 million. But they turned things around, and they're trusted for privacy. So today I've been asked to testify about the possibility of identity theft on the Healthcare.gov website and the potential consequences to the American public. Identity theft and medical identity theft are not victimless crimes and affect those who are most vulnerable in our society, such as the ill, the elderly, and the poor. So beyond doing these numerous research studies that I just mentioned, this is an issue that really struck home for me. Last year, my mother, she's 88 years old, she lives alone in Tucson, Arizona, and she suffered from a stroke. She was rushed to a hospital and admitted immediately, and unbeknownst to her, an identity theft was on the premises and made photocopies of her driver's license, debit cards, and credit cards that were in her purse. And by the way, she also has all the passwords to everything and a little Post-it note in her purse as well. She doesn't listen to me. That's the problem. The thief was able to wipe out her bank account, and there were charges on her credit card and debit card amounting to thousands and thousands of dollars. In addition to dealing with her serious health issues, she had to cope with the stress of recovering her losses and worry about more threats to her finances and medical records. The situation with my mom in the hospital and those who are sharing personal information on Healthcare.gov are not dissimilar. Let me explain. My mother had a reasonable expectation that the personal information she had in her wallet would not be stolen, especially by a hospital employee. And those who visit and enroll in Healthcare.gov have an expectation that people who are helping them purchase health insurance will not steal their identity. They also have a reasonable expectation that all necessary security safeguards are in place to prevent cyber attackers or malicious insiders from seizing their personal data. Now, in my opinion, the controversy regarding security of the Healthcare.gov website is both a technical issue, as we heard from these gentlemen, but it's also an emotional issue. In short, security controls alone will not ease the public's concern about the safety and privacy of their personal information. Based on our research, regaining the public's trust will be essential to the ultimate acceptance and success of this initiative. So following are some key facts that we learned from our consumer research over the more than decade of doing these kinds of studies. First, the public has actually a higher expectation that their data will be protected when they're dealing with government sites than commercial sites. In other words, when I'm going to the Veterans Administration, I have a higher expectation of privacy. Whether it's rational or not, that's basically what we see. Second, the loss of one's identity can destroy a person's wealth and reputation, and in some cases their health. Further, the compromise of credit and debit cards drives the cost of credit up for everyone, thus making it more difficult for Americans to procure goods and services. Third, medical identity theft negatively impacts the most vulnerable people in our nation. Beyond financial consequences, the contamination of health records caused by imposters can result in health misdiagnoses and in extreme cases could be fatal. Because there are no credit reports to track medical identity theft, it is nearly impossible to know if you've become a victim. So what's the solution? Let me just give you 3 ideas. First, on the trust issue, let's think about accountability. It's important to demonstrate accountability, and the best way to do that, in my mind, is rigorous adherence to high standards. And I think we mentioned NIST. NIST is a great standard, but very high standards above the bar, and showing the American people that this particular website or any website that collects sensitive personal information is meeting or exceeding that standard. Number 2 is ownership. What I like to see is the Chief Information Security Officer is your Chief Executive Officer. You know, that's good news when the CEO steps up to the plate and does what needs to be done. And in this case, I would love to see our President take ownership for the website and ensure that good security and privacy practices are met as a priority, not just on Healthcare.gov, but across the board. And third is verification. Now, I'm an auditor. I have to admit this. I'm a little bit biased, or I used to be an auditor at PricewaterhouseCoopers. This need that, you know, we can say that we're doing all of these good things, but having a third-party expert telling us that we are meeting and exceeding the standards is a very good idea and a noble idea. And with that being said, I think I'm actually the first person concluding, giving you some time back on the clock.
Well,
oh, no, I just go the other way.
Not exactly.
I wasn't watching the time. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Perlman. Appreciate your testimony. I'll recognize myself for questions. Let me direct my first one to Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, the administration maintains that there has not been a successful security attack on Healthcare.gov. Is that an accurate statement?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Basically, what we know for the monitoring and detection capabilities within the Healthcare.gov infrastructure is, as of November 17th, they had not stood up a security operations center or had the capabilities to even detect an actual attack. So they also stated they detected 32 attacks overall. However, if you have no monitoring and detection capabilities, period, how are you detecting all of the different attacks that are happening? So I'd say that the statement's accurate because they don't necessarily know the actual attacks that are occurring in there. In addition, I'd like to also mention that the Chief Information Security Officer from HHS, Kevin Charest, also said that I would say that the Healthcare.gov website did not follow best practices. So as a testament to Mr. Crush's testimony, the 800-53 and best practices were not followed and did not meet best practices when it was implemented.
Okay. Mr. Grigg.
Let me talk to that a little
I'm
bit.
sorry, Mr. Krush, you can get time from someone else. I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Grigg. Do you agree generally with the assessment by Mr. Kennedy that they don't have the capability? And furthermore, let me say that you did have administration officials say in November that there were 16, I think, security breaches or incidents, and then 32 in December. Are those figures plausible, and where do they get them?
Well, they're potentially plausible if they either weren't monitoring or they didn't pick up the attacks. For most of the sites we look at and companies we work with, we see anywhere from hundreds, potentially 1,000 or more hits a day. Now, a lot of that stuff is scripted, but for a number to be that low, I would either think, one, they're not detecting it, or two, their detection capability is not correct.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Grigg. Dr. Perlman, do the security standards, protections, and breach notification standards for Obamacare even meet the minimal standards put in place for the private sector?
I think the private sector, for the most part, and it does vary quite a bit. There are industry standards, for example, that actually I think are much higher than the standards we see in the government. But NIST, for example, and the need to comply with certain standards, like, for example, around cloud computing and FedRAMP, and there are standards that exist that are actually fairly reasonable. For the most part, though, that I think if you're looking for best practices, you probably would be looking at industry versus government.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Perlman. Mr. Kennedy, another question for you. Is Mr. Krush right in what he said in his oral testimony that passive pinging or reconnaissance of Healthcare.gov is not sufficient to raise concerns about the website's security?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to address that direct on, which would be passive reconnaissance. You have the ability to enumerate exposures and vulnerabilities. Any security researcher or tester that's been in the industry for a number of years, especially on the technical side, would be able to collaborate that. In fact, all 7 of the security researchers also said the same exact thing, that the website itself is vulnerable. This isn't speculation. These are actual exposures that are on the website today that could lead to personal information being exposed, as well as other critical flaws of actually attacking individual people just by visiting the website. So to answer your question, by doing passive reconnaissance, you can absolutely identify exposures. There's absolutely techniques out there without actually attacking the site for doing it. And I would question that, the other 7 security researchers that also testified that looked at the same type of research came to the same exact conclusion as myself.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Krush, I do have a question for you. Apparently, you have contracts with a company that does work for CMS. Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
And then what is the amount of those contracts, both past and present?
I actually don't know that off the top of my head, but I have
I think you have
tens of millions of dollars of contracts in the federal government right now.
Right. Okay. So you have tens of millions of dollars of business with CMS directly or indirectly.
Not CMS.
With a company that does work for CMS.
No, those amounts are very high. I'm talking across the government. I just don't know specifically with CMS. That's why I can actually talk from a technical perspective and not speculate
CMS,
on some of the
with CMS, according to your truth and
different
testimony that you filed, I think it's $1.5 million that you do have in those contracts.
Okay, that sounds good.
If you'll take my word for it.
Yep.
In that case, isn't it natural that we might suspect that your testimony is a result of your being paid by directly or indirectly by CMS, and here you're not going to actually testify against them if you have $1.5 million worth of contracts with them? Isn't that a reasonable assumption?
Well, Chairman Smith, actually, as it relates to CMS, if you look at the GAO docket, I actually have protesting with them. On the contracting side, me and CMS are not necessarily best of friends. I'm here to talk about the cybersecurity in what relates to healthcare.gov.
I know what you'd rather be talking about, but it still seems to me $1.5 million or more in contracts does perhaps influence your testimony. That's all I had to say on that. So my time is up, and the gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for her questions.
Thank you very much. Very interesting hearing. Mr. Cruz, you were cut off earlier when you were going to make a comment on Mr. Kennedy's testimony. Would you like to make that now?
I actually have a few here, so just across the board. Earlier, Mr. Grigg talked to the fact that, the Healthcare.gov didn't implement what we call FIPS 199 and FIPS 200. Just to clarify what that is for everyone here, FIPS 199 is Federal Information Processing Standard 199. It requires you to categorize an information system in accordance with the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of an information system. We know that that was completed because there was a letter from Ms. Tavener out as part of the authorization process. FIPS 200 is the baseline controls for all federal information systems. We also know that that was completed because they had an ATO letter that specified some of the vulnerabilities and what actual the process dealing with Healthcare.gov was. So I just wanted to talk to that point. Talking about also waiting from Target's perspective, waiting until a certain time to act. I don't think any of us here have also worked on the Target.com website or the back-end database, and I would tell you that a lot of the advanced attackers, unless you've done the forensic sampling and you've actually picked up the crumbs, you don't know when they actually attacked. And I think that that's under investigation right now. Healthcare.gov saying that Mr. Kennedy brought up the point that there was no security operations centers. Some of those $1 million that have been allocated to my company was actually related to those early on. There's actually 2 security operations centers within HHS you might want to know of. They have a centralized one, which does monitoring of the entire enterprise. And on top of that, CMS has its own security operations centers. And I can tell you from a technology perspective, some of the technologies they've implemented is top-notch. It's what you would expect in a top-tier security operations center in the U.S. federal government.
Thank you. According to Mr. Grigg's testimony that this site is a major target, but the attacks won't be accurate or of interest or of value until after March. What do you anticipate that March will bring?
Nothing. The truth is when it comes to March, if an attacker wants something off the site, they are going to continuously do whatever they can to gain access. I think one of the things that was also said is that there was a certain number of incidents, and those numbers do sound low, but once again, everybody here, none of us have worked in the Security Operations Center, which does exist within CMS, so we don't necessarily know what the escalation requirements are. So, for example, most government websites literally are enumerated passively, meaning, and this is still considered an incident via DHS. If you go through and you do scans on a website, meaning that you're looking for open ports, protocols, and services, that is considered an incident. Now, does every organization report those? No, because you would have hundreds of thousands of reports a day. However, some of the, I got a call last night from actually a news reporter, and they called me up to talk about Mr. Kennedy's, analysis he had done on the website. And I just want to be clear that, if him and his security researchers actually did go to a .gov, they did passively enumerate and actually pull data in an unauthorized manner, then that is a very significant issue. I was also, I went to the course while I was in the military for the FBI, and I can tell you that that is it's a great concern to us when anybody goes out to a federal government website without permission and is actually passively enumerating, then executing something to pull data off that website.
Thank you very much, Dr. Perlman. For my last few, you indicated that your mother had this incident happen with her identity. What about that stolen information affected her health care?
In the case of my mom, she would fall into the category of an identity. She's an identity theft victim, but not a medical identity theft victim, because not really her medical records were not exposed, and so that would be a different crime. Okay. And thank goodness she's not a medical identity theft victim, because that's bad news. It's really hard.
Thank you. My time is expired, but I hope someone would ask, the value of someone having hacked the Healthcare.gov.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Mr. Hall has said that because Mr. Brown has a time commitment that is almost immediate, he is going to allow Mr. Brown to go ahead of him in the questioning. So the gentleman, Mr. Brown, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Hall, for giving me this opportunity. It has come to the Oversight Committee subcommittee of this committee's attention that there is, or at least was, an Affordable Care Act Information Technology Exchanges Steering Committee chaired by senior White House officials, established back in May 2012, almost a year and a half before the rollout of Healthcare.gov. The White House Steering Committee's charter explicitly directed the formulation of a working groups, including one on security. It also turns out that a chairman of this Obamacare website steering committee is the U.S. Chief Technology Officer in the White House Science Office, who also happens to be the immediate past CTO of the Department of Health and Human Services. Upon learning this, I, as chairman of the Oversight Subcommittee, along with the full committee chairman, Mr. Smith, and Research and Technology Subcommittee Chairman, Dr. Buchan, sent a letter to the White House requesting that Mr. Todd Park, the U.S. CTO and Healthcare.gov Steering Committee Chairman, make himself available to the committee to answer questions regarding the security issues with Healthcare.gov by January 10th, last Friday. The White House has ignored that letter, that the committee's request, until just yesterday, when it provided a last-minute response that rebuffed this committee. Let me repeat, rebuffed this committee. And that letter did not come from the Senate-confirmed President's science advisor, to whom the letter was addressed, but from the politically appointed OSTP Legislative Affairs Director. My question for the panel simply is this: don't the American people deserve answers from those who are in charge of overseeing implementation of the Obamacare website's security protocol? After all, Mr. Park is the assistant to the President as the Chief Technology Officer of the United States and the chair of Healthcare.gov's steering committee. Wouldn't Mr. Park, or shouldn't he, know and be involved in the security details of the website? Starting with Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you, sir. When you look at a website and its security, there's multiple people that need to be involved to understand the progress of it. I would agree with your assessment that there should be some involvement in that case. In addition, I'd also like to clarify that the amount of information that we're getting around these security exposures of the website has actually been vast. You have the Chief Information Security Officer from HHS saying it didn't follow best practices. You have a number of other individuals saying the Security Operations Center hadn't been started yet. You have the Healthcare.gov infrastructure, which is completely independent and was started completely independent of HHS being part of that. So this is a mismanaged issue. I don't understand how we're still discussing whether or not the website is insecure or not. It is. There's no question about that.
It is insecure.
It is insecure, absolutely 100%. There's no questioning that. People from HHS have said that. You know, it's not a question of whether or not it's insecure. It's what we need to do to fix it. And just to point to Mr. Crush's point, he also said to Reuters, which is the article that he also mentioned earlier, Crush has not reviewed Kennedy's findings or done any work on Healthcare.gov's site itself. So, you know, this is all purely speculation. It's a bunch of hogwash, and personally, it seems to be politically biased, unfortunately.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Appreciate your long answer, but this is actually a yes or no answer, Mr. Crush. Do the American people deserve to know?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Grigg.
Yes, they do. However, I'd like to add, I understand the NIST process and others quite well. I co-authored a book on it, also developed a course for Villanova University on certification and accreditation. Finally, his statement as to a scan is not passive, a scan is active. But yes, they do deserve an answer on this.
Doctor?
Ditto, yes.
Well, I agree. The answer is yes. I'm very disappointed with the administration. We've asked for information. The American people deserve to have that information, and I'll do everything that we can to try to get Mr. Park to give us that information of the administration. And Mr. Chairman, my time's run out, so I yield back.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Brown. The gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards, is recognized for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses today. Just very quickly, Mr. Kennedy, do you have any federal contracts for security? Any?
As of right now, no.
Have you had?
Yes, I have.
And what were they?
Working for the federal government?
Yes. Federal security contracts?
Yes.
What were they?
I'd be happy to disclose those.
I'd appreciate in writing, if you would,
Sure.
if you would tell us the federal contracts that you've had in dealing with information security in the areas that you claim to be an expert in.
I would be happy to write that.
And Mr. Krush, just want to ask you really briefly if you could tell us the security standards, compare those that are used for the federal government as to the private sector. You've alluded to that a bit. If you could just very quickly.
Sure. So one thing to understand, and just to go back to Mr. Grigg, I've also co-authored a book on, and we've taken over 10,000 pages of information from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the Department of Defense instructions, the intelligence community directives, and also some of the SAP programs, and consolidated that. And that book's actually used in places such as Syracuse University to teach people that are actually want to understand this very rigorous federal process. I'm also a co-author of NIST Special Publication 853 Alpha. That's the process where we actually do the assessments per se. So
I trust your expertise. I just want to know the rigor of the standards for the federal government compared to the private sector.
Sure. So that's a great question, Ms. Edwards. One of the things to understand is that NIST Special Publication 853, starting at Revision 2, and we're now up to Revision 4, integrated all of the commercial standards. At Rev 3, so meaning, the most ISO, Carnegie Mellon, a lot of these organizations that had kind of best practices out there, they were integrated into that revision. By Revision 4, we've actually integrated the Department of Defense standards, the intelligence community standards, also a lot of standards that are kind of outside the realms. They're threat-based. Most, as you'll find, most auditing organizations don't look for those. So the depth and rigor compared from a commercial organization to what you'll get in the government, and I've worked on both sides. 50% of my contracts are with Fortune 50 and 100 companies. So I can tell you the depth and rigor that you implement on a federal information system, as it should be, is just much more intense than what you see in the commercial markets.
And is Healthcare.gov, is the rigor attached to Healthcare.gov any different from any of these other federal systems that you've indicated?
No, this process is the same across the U.S. government.
Thank you. So I wonder if the standards that you described are above, and I think you've said this, are above those that you would find in the commercial sector.
I would say yes.
Thank you. Mr. Grigg, you mentioned some information and speculation about medical records vis-a-vis Healthcare.gov. Are you aware of any medical record that is maintained on Healthcare.gov?
No, the information is simply passed through.
Exactly. Is there any medical record, personal medical record contained on Healthcare.gov?
No.
Thank you. And then, Dr. Perlman, just out of curiosity, you talked about your mother's experience, which just sounds really horrible, but she didn't experience identity theft through Healthcare.gov. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely not.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wonder, Mr. Krush, if you could help me, if you will, of the experience that you've had in developing and working on federal information systems, is it your conclusion that you would feel safe in putting your personal information through Healthcare.gov?
Ms. Edwards, I've actually put that in my testimony. I would put my personal information on Healthcare.gov. I've said this more than once, and I continue to stand by that.
Thank you. And Mr. Kennedy, lastly, I want to go back to your federal work. I mean, that I can find disclosed. I know that you got a small business loan from the Small Business Administration for, quote, businesses that do not qualify for credit in the open market. again, what is the other federal security work that you've done?
I'd be happy to disclose that in a written testimony.
Can you just give me an example right here on
I would
the
need
record?
to get permission from my customer. I work on non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality of information.
Okay.
Should I disclose my customer information to you?
What I would like to do, I'll write you a letter. Your financial disclosure that you've submitted in this record requires that. Did you put that in your financial disclosure?
No. No, listen, my experience,
Did you put
what
your-
question you asked me
let
was,
me-
did I have federal experience in the federal
It's
market?
my time, Mr. Kennedy.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you put that financial disclosure information in the record as required by our committee?
I'm not required to put that in there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's not on behalf of Trusted Sec. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Nogebauer, is recognized for his question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Grigg, I asked you this question. Could a security breach of Healthcare.gov result in people's medical files being accessed?
Yes, sir, it could. The information could be accessed, and then the real damage would come afterwards, how that information could be used. It could be used potentially to gain information of financial data. It could be used for identity theft. It could be misused many different ways. And that damage, as Mr. Kennedy alluded to earlier, is not just something as simple as replacing a credit card. This can be long-term, can be very damaging to an individual.
Now, there was a recent GAO report that documented that there was a 111% increase in federal agency data breaches in the past 3 years. Specifically, the GAO report noted that there were 22,156 incidents revealing sensitive personal information since 2012, up from 10,000 in 2009. Interestingly enough, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the Healthcare.gov operator, had the second most breaches in the report by FY 2012. Ms. Cruz said that the hackers are going where the money is and not necessarily interested in these government sites, but yet we see a substantial increase in the number of incidents that are happening. Mr. Kennedy, do you agree with Ms. Cruz that people really aren't interested in these government sites, or what's your opinion on that?
Thank you, sir. I do not agree with Mr. Cruz's testimony there. I believe that the hackers move where the money is, and there is a lot of money to still be made in the personal information side, as well as other government agencies that look to do demise to us, especially on our information technology-related issues. Having direct access into DHS, IRS is a treasure trove for additional attackers out there. There's a lot of money for the organized crime. There's a lot of money for what we call state-sponsored attacks. So I would not agree with this assessment. There's plenty of money being made in the government space, and there's breaches happening all the time there.
What would be some of the, if I go to a government site and I'm a hacker, what are the treasures out there that I'm going to glean that's going to help me do whatever bad thing is I have in mind?
Sure. I think that's the question. It depends purely on the motivation of the attacker. So you have, really three criteria of attackers. You have your average black hat that may be politically motivated to prove a specific point or street credibility. You have your organized crime, which are specifically looking for monetary value or persistent access into organizations. There's also a huge black market right now that's surpassed the credit card industry for what we call carders. Selling compromised infrastructures and organizations is a huge market right now. If I can say, hey, I compromised government X or Healthcare.gov, I can sell that to an attacker for thousands of dollars to make a big buck off of it. Additionally, so you have that portion of it, the identity theft, the fraud, other areas there. Then you have the state-sponsored element, which is other government entities attacking the infrastructure in order to infiltrate, gain access and intelligence on us, and that's a huge business right now. We see it obviously happening off of multiple other government entities, as well as Eastern European countries.
Would you feel comfortable putting your personal information in Healthcare.gov?
Absolutely not.
Yeah. Mr. Grigg?
No, sir, I would not.
Dr. Perlman, would you?
I'm not sure.
Yeah. I want to go back to you, Dr. Perlman. One of the things that, you talked about was that, you wanted to talk about the consequences of stolen identity.
Sure.
Yeah. So one of the things I think might be helpful is people that are forced to go to access their health care through government Healthcare.gov, what would you advise them to do? They're going to have to access that as they're filling out that information. Are there some preventative things that they can do that would minimize, some of the potential consequences if the system is breached?
Well, obviously, if the site is secure, that's a good step, right? But as an individual, whether we're doing it on Healthcare.gov or whether it's a website like Amazon.com, we need to be smart. We need to understand that our data could be at risk. The bad guys are really smart. For example, we should not be using the same password over and over again. Our computer should have the most current version of antivirus or anti-malware technology. Things that these commonsensical approaches does make a difference, and that should be across the board. But again, if you have data that is extremely sensitive and confidential, then basically your level of concern should go up. And a lot of people don't think about these issues well enough, or they don't think that they will become a victim. But as we know, with 110 million records here and 90 million records there, every single person in this room is a victim of some data loss, and probably at least had one data breach notification in the last 5 years. So it's a big problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Nagelbauer. The gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, is recognized for her questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. This hearing is ostensibly about Healthcare.gov, but I just want to make a big picture comment that the Affordable Care Act is certainly about more than a website. It's about an issue of great importance, which is about the availability of health care to all Americans. Now, when I saw the title of this hearing, I was pretty interested. I actually have a background in consumer protection, used to work at the Federal Trade Commission, we have worked on identity theft issues. I was a little baffled, frankly, about why we're doing this in the context of Healthcare.gov and in the Science Committee. That being said, we all acknowledge that there have been some serious technological problems rolling out the Affordable Care Act. But I'm really concerned that some people listening, our constituents, might really be concerned that there are risks involved in enrolling through the website that aren't really there. So I want to clarify a couple of things. First of all, I want to make it clear to our constituents that identity theft is already a federal crime. That if someone knowingly commits identity theft, that's a federal crime. If they do it aggravated identity theft, there are enhanced penalties. So I want to make clear that if there is identity theft, that is already against the law. The Department of Justice prosecutes that. The Federal Trade Commission has civil laws dealing with it. So identity theft is an issue we should be concerned about, but I'm baffled about why we're talking about it in the terms of Healthcare.gov. So, Mr. Krush, I want to ask you a couple of questions. First, I want to acknowledge and thank you for your service to this country. I understand, Dr. Perlman, you're a veteran as well. Thank you for your service. Mr. Krush, you talked about how some people are suggesting that Healthcare.gov is a major target for hackers. Based on your background, your military and cybersecurity background, could you discuss the range of hackers and their different motives, and talk about where Healthcare.gov is on the scale of high payoff targets? And you mentioned this in your testimony, but will you talk about that range just a bit, please?
Yes, actually, it's very interesting in that, we're here on the Committee of Science, Space, and Technology, and I will tell you something from a high payoff target perspective, especially when you're dealing with advanced attackers. The more the nation-sponsored attackers and those even on the criminal organizations, they're after some very specific targets, and I'm not going to go into those, but I will tell you. From a government perspective, in all reality, if you're looking at the .mil and the .gov kind of domains, Healthcare.gov is not really a huge high payoff target. Space systems, technology related to weapon systems, intellectual property stores, information related to clearances, information related to quite possibly not only personal information on a person, but maybe weaknesses such as relationship issues where they could be played on or through blackmail. There's websites that include information on criminals that are actually part of the court systems. literally we keep all of this information online now. As you can imagine, from an attacker's perspective, you could literally, not delete the paper, but there's ways that you could get into a system and change an outcome of quite possibly, cases or what actually you have done in the past. So there's lots of high payout targets.
Thank you so much. I want to follow up a little bit. It's my understanding that we've already established that there aren't medical records on Healthcare.gov, and Mr. Grigg confirmed that in response to Representative Edwards' question. Do you agree with that? There are no medical records on Healthcare.gov.
Correct. Right? Those would be the providers.
And would you agree that there is more personal information in a federal tax return than there is in a Healthcare.gov insurance application?
I agree.
Mr. Kennedy, do you agree with that?
I do agree.
Mr. Grigg?
I do agree.
Dr. Perlman?
I agree.
Terrific. Okay, so about 80% of the people in this country file their tax returns online. Mr. Cruz, do you file your tax returns online?
I do.
Mr. Grigg, do you file your tax returns online? Dr. Perlman, do you file your tax returns online?
I'm old-fashioned, no.
Mr. Kennedy?
I'm old-fashioned as well.
So
Mostly young things.
When you understand that about 80% of the people in this country file their tax returns online, we're talking about security with Healthcare.gov when there's more personal information on a federal tax return. I just want to highlight that we're talking about security with Healthcare.gov when the majority of people file their tax returns online. All of you call for third parties to conduct security testing. And the MITRE Corporation, Blue Canopy, and Frontier Security have all been doing that for months. In your opinion, are those companies competent to do the work? Yes or no? Mr. Cruz?
Yes.
Mr. Kennedy?
Yes.
Mr. Grigg?
Yes.
Dr. Perlman?
I only have knowledge of MITRE, and the answer is yes.
Thank you. Mr. Cruz, to be clear, there have been no cases of a person's identity being stolen through Healthcare.gov at this point. Is that correct?
That is correct. Okay.
I just want to clear that up because the title of the hearing suggests that one of the consequences of signing up through Healthcare.gov is going to be identity theft. So I wanted to clarify that. So my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. The gentleman from Texas, the Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Hall, is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the hearing and the witnesses. I like old-fashioned people. I don't know why. But I'll ask my fellow Texan there, Mr. Grigg. There's been talk about March the 31st, and I think you mentioned it since the deadline for open enrollment is not until March the 31st. Wouldn't hackers be kind of foolish to exploit the website now because they potentially have the opportunity to retrieve a heck of a lot more information after that date? Do they think like that, or is that too...
No, sir. They do in many ways look for the big payoff. And as was mentioned earlier, really cybercrime can be broken down into two areas. One is the individuals looking for military, looking for that type of information. But a big other portion of it today is monetarily driven. We see a lot of that out of places like Eastern Europe. We see it out of places like Russia. And those individuals are looking for personal information. They're looking for things that they can make financial payoff from. And to wait until the time was right would very much be to their advantage. And while it is true information is not held on Healthcare.gov, information is passed through that site that they could potentially manipulate or take advantage of.
Thank you. And I've heard of a lot of problems, but given the problems of the website to date, would you say it's highly likely that there will be breaches to the healthcare website?
Yes, sir. I do believe it's very possible, or it is probable at this current state of the site that could happen.
And once one's occurred, how quickly can experts find out about the breach?
That all depends. We've seen in previous cases with things like GhostRat, GhostNet Trojan. We've seen in cases like with Google and Aurora and others. In some instances, those organizations didn't know till weeks or months later.
How quickly should the American people be notified in the event of a breach?
Immediately.
Within hours, days, a week, or just right now?
Right now.
That's pretty clear. Once a breach has occurred and people have been notified, what actions should people take?
Immediately start to do things like Dr. Perlman mentioned as far as change passwords, change IDs, especially notify and talk to your credit card companies.
Yeah,
look at your credit card statements. Also, check your credit rating, and look at the credit rating organizations, because many times, just like what period of about a week ago, I got an email from Amazon that someone tried to open up an account under my name, and I immediately called my credit card provider and found out someone had charged about $5,000 worth of merchandise under my name because someone had stolen my credit card. So you immediately need to take action for that stuff to put a stop to it if the credit card company doesn't catch it.
This is not like Target where you can check with your bank or your credit card company for even suspicious activity or something you think might be happening. I think that's what you're telling me.
Yes, sir, that is correct.
And how do you find out how did you find out if your Social Security number, is that the way they got to you?
No, sir, they get a credit card number from me.
Credit card.
Yeah, credit card
and
number.
Medical information have been compromised, and what would you do about it?
Be very tough with medical information, or if someone is potentially obtained medical services under your name, you may not find out until you actually get the bill, or if they've sent that to another address, you may not find out until you maybe get denied for a job because they said you had a pre-existing condition they didn't know of.
Well, just briefly, what are the steps involved in repairing a breach?
It's very tough.
And should a website be shut down while these remedies are being considered?
I would say yes, it should, and I mean it's very tough because first you have to contest those charges, and if it's related to medical, as soon as you contest it under HIPAA and other laws, then you have no access to the records or information because it's not your information anymore, so it can be very difficult.
Well, my time's almost gone. I believe that all of you would agree that while no website can be 100% safe, every precaution needs to be taken to ensure the security of the site. Now, Mr. Chairman, there are far too many questions surrounding the launch of the healthcare website, and until these are resolved, the security of Americans' personal information is going to remain at risk. Is that your understanding? Is that why we're having this hearing?
That is exactly correct, Mr.
And I thank you for the work on this issue, and I thank each of you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for a good hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Would you yield me the balance of your time?
I yield my balance of my time today, tomorrow, or next week, or any time.
Mr. Kennedy, I'd like for you to re-emphasize the point you made in response to my initial question about why the government doesn't even know whether it's been hacked or not, that is Healthcare.gov, why the government really can't say or state credibly that there have been no successful security attacks.
Yes, sir. So if you look at the Healthcare.gov infrastructure, it was built independently of HHS, including the Security Operations Center piece. There's contractual language around that. There's testimony in front of Congress that also states that as well. So the Security Operations Center, as of November 17th, had not been built or implemented, which means that they didn't have the security monitoring and detection capabilities to detect the attacks that are being mentioned here today. So to reemphasize, they don't know.
And they don't know. That's why they can say there hasn't been any. They're not in position to know one way or the other.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Kennedy.
Yes, sir.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Takano, is recognized for his question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Krush, would you like to respond to that?
Sure, I'd love to. Actually, we've been talking about all of the supposable breaches that have been going on related to Healthcare.gov. If they couldn't monitor those, how in the world do you have a number? The number would be 0 if there was no capability to actually look at what kind of attacks are coming through the ether.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Grigg, I'd like to focus on a couple of areas of your testimony. First, you argue that the site, Healthcare.gov, really needs a third party working to probe the system for weaknesses. And second, you assert that medical records are at risk on Healthcare.gov, and you list the kinds of damage that can be done with stolen medical records. And you state previously in a Huffington Post post that, quote, however, the U.S. has some of the very best minds in the world when it comes to cybersecurity, and there's no doubt that Healthcare.gov can be fixed if the right people are given the chance to test it. End quote. Do you still feel that way?
Yes, sir. That's one of the reasons why I'm here today. Okay. Because I believe with independent third-party assessment and the right assessment done, we can get to the bottom of this.
Okay. Well, thank you. I just want to. Were you aware prior to your testimony today that MITRE, Blue Canopy, and Frontier Security were all working on third-party verification?
MITRE, yes. The others, no.
Okay. You were aware that MITRE was aware. So I don't understand how in your testimony, you still assert that third-party work needs to be done, but you had knowledge that a third-party audit was actually being conducted by MITRE?
Yes, one, the article was written before that. It was written before that time, and two, I do not know if MITRE has finished their research or not, or what the findings of those are.
Okay, but you did raise this question as if third-party verification. I was led to the impression that third-party verification wasn't being done, but in fact you had knowledge it was being done.
Not at the time of the article.
Okay, but in your testimony you lead us to believe that you raise it as a concern, but it has been being done.
You quoted the article, and you quoted a statement directly from the article that I said that needed to be done. At that time, nothing had been done.
But it's not in your question. But the testimony that you submitted for this committee doesn't acknowledge it. But yet you're telling me here you had knowledge of it, that it was being done. Your testimony leads us to believe that it was not being done.
As of this hearing, I do have knowledge.
Okay, at
the time of the article, no.
Okay, very very well. Dr. Perlman, you talk about the medical records, and identity theft, and a lot of your work has shown that 95% of the people who commit these sort of deeds are motivated by Robin Hood motivations. Would you explain about that a little bit?
It's not 90%, but it's a large percentage. I think it's 29 or 30%, but it's still pretty significant. A Robin Hood crime, as we define it in the research, is where someone, for example, has a family member or friend who basically has an illness and they're not insured, and basically they will kind of look the other way, if you will, and allow that person to use their insurance credentials so that when they show up at a hospital or a clinic, they're getting better treatment than just right off the street.
Well, common sense would sort of tell me if that's sort of the big motivation, what motivates someone to go and try to steal someone's identity, that expanding health care coverage, providing quality coverage for more and more people would reduce the likelihood of this sort of crime.
You have to understand, I'll be biased in that because I think we all deserve good health care. So if basically you had good health care, the value of a credential would be meaningless, right? Because we all have a credential. So there's no value, if you will, in stealing someone's credential because everyone's going to have a credential that will give them reasonable health care.
So actually, if we made this health care website, it was very successful, and more people got enrolled, we would reduce the risk of the misuse of medical records.
It could work one way or another. It's really hard to determine that. In theory, you're right. I mean, you could basically say that 29 or 30%, the Robin Hood portion of the crime of medical identity theft, might actually be non-existent.
So we could possibly remove a huge motive for people to try to hack into the system.
Yeah, but remember, the value of a medical record is more than just getting the insurance. You see, that's only a very small part of it. There's a lot of information, rich information. And we've done studies in the Russian Federation and other parts of the world, and if you had to look at the most valuable piece of information right now on an individual basis, it would be a medical record. And in fact, just yesterday in Fox News, Business News, they did an article on the value of different types of information. And medical information in the black market is much, much more valuable than, say, credit or debit card information or authentication data.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Takano. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Buchan, is recognized for his questions.
Well, thank you all for being here. It's a fascinating hearing. We had a previous hearing, which was also very fascinating. And we were 4 for 4. No one would get on the website last time, but we're 3 for 4 this time. So in my view, this is about confidence the American people have in their government and whether or not their government is doing everything they can to protect their privacy. It's not about health care at all. We could be talking about any other website that the federal government has. And we know the GAO came out and reported thousands of breaches across the federal government. So to argue that this website is going to be secure and that nothing's going to happen, I think, is a false argument because it is going to be breached. There is going to be information stolen. I think from my perspective, I was a medical doctor before. I think when you throw in the health care part of it, it becomes very personal for people. I mean, I understand, you know, people out there in my district are concerned about the Department of Defense being hacked, maybe a few people. But when you start talking about potential for information that they perceive, whether it's real or whether it's perceived, is personal information, I think all of us in hearings like this and across government, in the administration, in both political parties, need to recognize the fact we need to do whatever we can to regain the confidence of the American people that we're protecting their personal information as best we can. Even though I do recognize the website itself doesn't have that on there, it does have portals that people that are smart can potentially access that. And this is actually one of the biggest problems in electronic medical records that we have. My medical practice established an electronic medical record in 2005. I love electronic medical records. But there are two issues. There's, of course, security issues, and then there's compatibility issues about getting medical information across different types of electronic medical records. You know, I think it's unfortunate that all of you are somewhat subjected to a national discussion about health care, and I appreciate all of you trying to confine your comments to the security aspects and not the larger national debate about how we provide quality, affordable health care to all our citizens, which I think is a goal we all have, and certainly as a medical doctor I have. So it really doesn't matter if Healthcare.gov is a low-propensity target by some hackers out there. In the minds of the American people, when you mention their health care, this is the biggest target in the federal government in their minds. Whether that's real or perceived doesn't really make a difference. So, Mr. Krush, I mean, you know, the GAO came out with this report, as you know, in 2012, saying there were 22,156 data breaches, 4,000 at CMS alone. And you have a relationship with CMS, so, I mean, you have to recognize that we can't make the case that any website is going to be secure to try to make a political argument to prove that the way we're managing health care is the right way to go. I mean, that's not the discussion, is it? The discussion is, how do we protect information? You'd have to agree with that, wouldn't you?
I absolutely agree with that. I will just say that I agree with that, and with the idea that the process that we use you know, to secure the data on federal information systems is just very rigorous, and that's my complete argument here.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think when it comes to the confidence, I know we've discussed third-party people out there looking at this, and I'll be honest with you, I'm a member of Congress, and I have no idea whether there's a third-party person out there, and there obviously is, looking at this. So our charge is to get that to the American people. Whether it's because if the American people don't know, and I can tell you as a political person, trying to get a message across to 700,000 people is difficult, and that's just 700,000 people. We need to do better getting the information out that there are actually people that aren't in government that are looking at this to preserve people's personal records. That's my view. Mr. Kennedy, how do we do that?
Well, I think if you look at the broader picture here, and not just Healthcare.gov, but just in the federal space, end-to-end testing, proactive security measures, things that are definitely outlined as being best-of-breed security practices need to be performed. And I'm not saying that NIST doesn't have those. It's just they're loosely followed. To comply with FSMA is not necessarily a rigorous process. So what I have to say to that is, we have to focus on putting security in the very forefront, in the very beginning stages of when we hire a contractor or we go after another organization, through the entire process of that. Healthcare.gov is a prime example of the failures of being able to implement security in a rigorous manner or in a process that includes security throughout the entire life cycle. And if you do that, you have a better product. You have something that people can stand by and say, listen, we're doing our reasonable amount of assurance here that we're protecting your information, not just, kind of slapping it together and throwing it out there.
My time has expired. I'd like to say let's all of us work together to regain the confidence of the American people. Thank you.
Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Buchan. I'm sorry?
Mr. Chairman, I have a parliamentary inquiry.
The gentlewoman is recognized for her parliamentary inquiry.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, isn't it true that the committee and House rules require witnesses to submit factually correct financial disclosures forms?
There are certain limitations to that, but within those limitations, I think that's the case, and I think all of our witnesses have done so today. The gentleman from
Mr. Chairman?
Yes. The gentlewoman continues to be recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to...
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I make a point of order that the witness testifying today has not complied with the House Committee's rules regarding financial disclosure, and under those circumstances, I request that the testimony be stricken from the record.
Obviously, I object to that, and I'm afraid that the gentlewoman is not the one to make that determination.
I am not finished.
Does the
I have
gentleman
been recognized, Mr. Chairman.
Does the gentleman have something to say that's pertinent to her inquiry?
I am very concerned about the testimony we heard from Mr. Kennedy a moment ago. He testified on the record that he did not disclose government contracts in his truth and testimony form that he and his company have received, and our committee rules require
he also said he was not required under the
requirement to be filled out by each witness. On that form, Mr. Kennedy answered the question saying not applicable. This means that he did not comply with the rules of our committee, and as such, I ask that he be removed from continuing
that is not necessarily a legitimate
until he accurately and fully discloses the federal grants and contracts that he or the entity he represents have received on or after October the 1st, 2011.
Mr. Kennedy, do you want to respond whether you're required to disclose that or not?
Thank you, sir. The question was, have I done work in the federal space in the, prior in the past or currently? The answer to that is, on behalf of Trusted Sec, we do not do work in the public sector or government, which is what I disclosed in the statement there. In addition, I have worked for NASA as well as other federal government agencies in my capacity as a chief security officer for a Fortune 1000 company, as well as my prior roles as a security consultant for former entities. So to answer the question there and what was submitted, I do not do work for the public sector. I'm plenty busy in the private sector keeping everybody else protected. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. I think you've answered the question. I'd like to continue our questions, and the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy, is recognized for his.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I wanted to start out by saying I think Teresa Fryer was mentioned earlier in this hearing, and I know that she's actually testifying, I think, at this moment or just moments ago in front of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. And her testimony before was referenced about some of her remarks on Healthcare.gov, and she just recently said today that the Healthcare.gov website is secure based on a December 18th security assessment. She stated that the system exceeds the best practices to ensure security and that the risk mitigation policies are being implemented and executed as planned. As a result, attacks have been successfully prevented. She recommends that a new ATO should be given when the current one expires, just to make sure that we are all up to date on the current testimony. Now, a couple of, I think, points of clarification. Mr. Kennedy, I think one of us here supports the ACA, but I'll leave that up for the gallery to decide. Now, I noticed I think in your initial testimony and the initial testimony of the witnesses, you were nodding your head when Mr. Crush said that unless you were actually able to dive into the inner workings of the website, which you have made clear that you did not hack into, you did not do anything illegal, but that you would not have any way of knowing in detail what part was vulnerable to attack unless you had done so. Is that accurate?
We can't tell the inside of Healthcare.gov without actually testing it. That is 100% accurate. What we can see are symptoms of a much larger issue. And if you would mind, if I can read a test, one of the things that I submitted from Ed SCOTUS, just as an example, if you're okay with that.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. SCOTUS said, I've worked on dozens of large-scale breach cases over the past 12 years, looking at the root cause vulnerabilities of attacker methods. Reviewing the security issue discovered in Healthcare.gov said, I can tell you this is a breach waiting to happen. Or given the numerous vulnerabilities, perhaps a breach has already happened. These are exactly and emphasized on that, the kind of security flaws bad guys exploit in large-scale breaches.
Mr. Kennedy, yes, and I appreciate that, but the point is, and I think we've heard it actually reiterated a number of times here, is that we don't know. You don't know. You testified before that HHS doesn't know. If HHS doesn't know, you don't know. So much of this is, in fact, it's a concern, but it's speculative, right?
To the underlying portion of Healthcare.gov, absolutely, yes.
Okay. So now, thank you. And Mr. Kirsch, do you, out of your expertise, can you just give me, off the top of your head, what you believe to be the biggest data breaches, recent data breaches? This is something that's fairly common. Obviously, Target and Neiman Marcus in the news today. How many are you aware of others?
Well,
Interestingly enough, the thing when it comes to data breaches, I think Target is a perfect example of someone that had the capability to identify a breach. The thing that is of most concern to me is that there are a lot of industry and even government organizations that don't have the capability to do that.
So, sir, Target, Neiman Marcus, obviously in the news now. Do you recall Heartland Payment Systems data breach back in 2008? Does that ring a bell with you?
It does.
It's about, at least from some estimates, 134 million credit cards exposed. How about TJX Companies in 2006? 94 million credit cards exposed. Epsilon, which exposed the emails of millions of customers stored over 108 different retail chains. RSA Security, top-notch security firm. Sony PlayStation Network, over 77 million PlayStation Network accounts exposed. All private sector, yes?
Yes.
This is something the private sector invests billions of dollars a year in trying to protect, yes?
Yes.
This is something that is very difficult and has to be on the cutting edge in order to defend against, yes?
Yes.
Are you aware of how many times the House of Representatives has voted to cut funding or repeal the Affordable Care Act in this Congress?
I am not.
Would the number close to 50 seem accurate to you?
Unfortunately, I just don't have that insight. I can
Well,
talk about risk assessment if you like.
Take my word for it. I yield back the balance of my time.
We'll confirm that. Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Bridenstine, is recognized for his question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the time. I'd like to start by asking our witnesses a question. Are you familiar with Troy Trinkle? He was the Chief Information Officer for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. His job was to oversee the development of Healthcare.gov, and his job was to, as the last thing before launching the website, he had a security waiver he was supposed to sign. Do you guys remember any of this by chance? And he didn't sign it. He refused to sign it, and he resigned. His boss, Marilyn Tavener, CMS administrator, who's not a chief information officer, who arguably would not be qualified to sign off on a security waiver, she signed it. He didn't. He's qualified. She did. He's not qualified. She's an appointee of the President of the United States. Interestingly, her boss, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius, testified before Congress that she had no idea that a security waiver was supposed to be signed, that it didn't get signed, and that her subordinate, another Barack Obama appointee, signed it. She didn't know. I mean, it would seem to me you have a qualified person not signing it and then having to resign, and the administration was not clear about why that person had to resign, namely Troy Trinkle. In fact, they didn't answer the question why. But it would appear, and this gives me concern, that people are making decisions for political reasons, not in the best interest of security of our citizens. And so some of you on this panel are CEOs, I think 3 of you, and then one leads a research institution. Just a quick yes or no answer. In your institutions, if this was going on, would you guys have an issue with it? Would somebody in your organization be fired? We'll start with you, Mr. Kennedy, and just go down the row.
Coming from being a chief security officer for a Fortune 1000 company, I would say the answer to that would be yes. That would raise a major concern for me.
I would just talk to the point that the authorizing official, if it was the CISO, and he or she was the one authorized to sign for that system, this is actually one of the breakdowns in the risk management framework right now. You have what's called, you usually have the CIO or the director that are in charge of maybe a program, an organization, and they are directed as the authorizing official. I would say, if we're going to look at it, one of the weaknesses in the process government-wide is that chief information security officer should be where the buck stops always. Right now,
so you're acknowledging that he should have signed it if it was secure, and his refusal is a big breach of trust here with the American people.
I acknowledge that under
and then he was forced to resign, arguably.
The current process allows for the authorizing official to be whoever's directly in charge of the entire information system. So that being said, I think that that's a weakness in the process. Right now, it should be the Chief Information Security Officer of where it stops. They're supposed to know the system, the security capabilities, and they're supposed to be the ones that should be responsible. But that's not the process that we're currently using in the government.
Well, it was the process that was supposed to be used until he refused and then resigned. Going down the line.
I would also say yes, and I would add to that as we talked about earlier with external third parties looking at this, that's just a piece of it, them looking at it. The other part is those items are actually implemented and they're signed off on.
So it's my turn, I suppose. Yeah, it's a big ethical issue, in my opinion. I think the key variable is that security of our country and the citizens of our country should be more than a political issue.
Agreed.
But I don't think the solution is to have local CISOs, people are middle-level management. It should be a major function of the government should be to have a CISO for the entire United States.
I'm going to bring back my time. I've only got 30 more seconds, but I appreciate your answer, and you can submit it for the record.
Absolutely.
But I'd like to just say that I'm not going to put this in for the record, Mr. Chairman, because I don't want it to create any issues on the other side of the aisle. But this comes from an article from CBS News dated November 6, 2013. So people watching at home have access to it. It's on the internet. It's all been disclosed. And I'd like to say finally in my last 5 seconds. This is exactly why the American people have lost trust in their government. This is exactly why the American people have lost trust in their government. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bridenstine. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Holtgren, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. This is such an important topic and something I'm certainly hearing from my constituents as I travel around my district of great concern and wanting answers. And so I appreciate you being here. I've got a couple different questions. I'm going to address the first one to Mr. Krusch, if I could. According to your written testimony, you say that based on what you have read publicly thus far, Healthcare.gov, and I quote, Healthcare.gov is most likely categorized as a moderate system, referring to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST's, security levels of low, moderate, and high. I wonder, is that an appropriate categorization for this kind of personal data that we're talking about here being available and accessible through Healthcare.gov website, including people's medical files?
So usually we reserve high for, grave danger to national security, to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability could, for most of the high systems are usually, to me, when something's categorized with that, it's usually life or death. And since Healthcare.gov is not that, there are some areas where, depending on the organization, there's something called organizationally defined parameters. That allows the organization to say if they process, store, transmit, manage, or review privacy data, it allows them to make the recommendation to go to high. But from what I've read thus far about the site, because of the interactions with the other websites, meaning the handing off through the controlled APIs and the way that it deals with interconnections, it still would be moderate. If one of those interconnections are high, then what they have to do is actually, we're going to do this anyways, they have to develop what's called an ISA, an interconnection security agreement. And what that requires both sides to do is agree on the cybersecurity rules, including on how quickly they report any incidents related to those.
Let me jump in here real quick. I would say, again, for my constituents, this is high concern to them, and I think for us as well, and I would agree with my colleagues of how important this is in people's lives. And, talking about medical care, sounds like life and death to me oftentimes is making sure that our medical records are protected. I'm going to jump to Mr. Grigg. Is there any evidence that Healthcare.gov meets NIST's data security standards, and who should certify that Healthcare.gov complies with the Federal Information Security Management Act?
I have not seen that evidence as far as whether or not they've been certified, so I cannot say on that.
Okay. Let me open this up to any others. I don't know if Mr. Kennedy, Dr. Let me open this up to you all, any thoughts you might have. National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST again, provides agencies with the guidance they need to develop and launch networks and websites that are fully and properly secure. Should NIST's role be expanded or increased with any new authority and responsibility, specifically in regards to Healthcare.gov? Would NIST be best qualified to verify and certify how well agencies meet their security standards, compliance, and in today's case, should NIST review Healthcare.gov? Start with Mr. Kennedy.
I would agree with that. I think if you look at, not just technology-specific areas, you have the CDC, the Center of Disease Control and Protection, which is really about getting information to the American people about diseases, things like that. Same oversight needs to be there, and the expansiveness of NIST needs to be there for more of a governance structure over our security practices inside the government. Again, this is more of a guidance role right now to adhere to. I think the expansiveness of this is really to bring more security and integration throughout the whole government, the whole federal government, to really build best practices in. Right now, it's kind of intermittent on whether or not they do it or not. So I agree with that, yes.
Any other comments or thoughts?
They currently write the guidelines, the NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology special publications, and also they write different guidance on different types of technologies. I think just understanding systems from a risk perspective, if you have one organization that's in charge of the information security for every single government organization, you'll never come to the same risk decision. The problem lies in the fact that somebody at HHS is going to know about HHS systems and the security and the requirements better than someone, in an office somewhere up at NIST.
I think my fear is accountability too, and making sure sometimes I see it in bureaucracies, there's a desire to protect, hey, if we've ever breached, don't let anybody know. I want to make sure that doesn't happen. Mr. Grigg, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, but I would agree many times this stuff is covered up and it's not released immediately. We even see with Target, we've gotten some information, but yet to see the full picture.
Okay. Dr. Ponemon, real quick, what are some of the serious consequences that consumers face in the wake of medical identity theft? Are there financial consequences in addition to medical consequences?
Yeah, in our research, we find that a fairly large percentage of our sample has suffered some financial consequences, and sometimes it's just staggering. It could be thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. Keep in mind that the people who are at risk are not necessarily wealthy people who are low income. And so on a proportional level, it could be like their total yearly income, just basically on the costs associated with cleaning up your medical record.
Yeah. Doctor, you're right. And I think that's my fear, is those who are most vulnerable or right on the edge.
Absolutely.
Something happens there, they don't have anything to fall back on. People with significant resources do. Thank you again for being here, Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Holtgren. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you. Is it crush or crush? I've heard it both ways.
It's crush, but in the Army I used to say crush.
It's crush. Okay. All right. Well, just call you for dinner is the main thing, right? Mr. Cruz, you said, I think you were lucky enough to work for the HHS, or was it the CMS?
So I was fortunate enough to work early on the central office at HHS. I've also provided training actually related to the risk management framework, and we develop online training for CMS.
Well, I want to draw attention to the word luck. You said you were lucky, but then later you said you had contracts totaling around $10 million? 1 million? 10 million?
1 million.
1 million? Okay.
I would say when I was talking about luck, I was actually talking about the individuals that are at central office are probably some of the most talented cybersecurity people I've met, and that's just the truth. I've worked with them when they were contractors, and now they are in charge of our cyber.
You said in working for the CMS, and I wrote it down, you weren't best of friends, quote unquote.
That's correct with CMS.
Was the words you used.
We actually had a recent protest with them, and so.
Okay. But you had government contracts, so you might not have been best of friends, but you weren't enemies, right?
Absolutely not.
Yeah, you weren't enemies. I mean, it wasn't maybe a marriage, but at that dollar rate, you might be interested in a long-term relationship. What do you think?
At those dollar amounts, a
yes,
long-term relationship, if it was a little bit more, probably.
Okay, I see. You're going to play hard to get. So were you hired on experience and good performance?
Absolutely.
Okay. So you think performance is important?
Absolutely.
So would you say that the performance in rolling out Healthcare.gov was sterling or problematic?
It was problematic.
Very problematic. Can you understand how some Americans would question the ability of the company that put together Healthcare.gov?
I can.
Sure, makes sense. So it's no surprise to you that their credibility has been called into question. Mm-hmm. Do you fault us for doing our due diligence to try to protect the American public?
I do not.
So you think it's a good thing what we're doing here?
I think that every time, unfortunately, we're, as a nation, fairly reactive just like, industry. We wait till something big happens before we talk about it. Cybersecurity, the reason it's getting the preference.
Yes or no? It's a good thing we're doing here because I'm running out of time.
Oh, absolutely. It's a good thing.
Good. Well, I'm glad.
Talk about it.
Good. I'm glad to hear you say that. Mr. Kennedy, you also think it's a good thing?
Absolutely, I do.
Have a Mr. Grigg?
Yes, I do.
Doctor?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear that we're finally doing something that's advantageous. That's kind of rare for Congress. Mr. Krush, on February the 19th, 2013, you tweeted, "Don't just worry about China breaking into systems." And then you went on Fox News and talked about it. Do you recall that?
I don't remember that tweet, but yeah, I'm very actually I don't tweet that much at all, but I did go on Fox News related to the APT, correct?
Yeah, no, you don't do a lot of tweeting. I looked at them. When you tweeted out, "Don't just worry about China breaking into systems," what do you mean by that?
Actually, I think, sir, that was probably when I was tweeting, I just reposted a news article, and that was probably just the title.
But you recognize that we have a lot of cybersecurity attacks hitting our government, like 1 million a year.
Oh, absolutely. I've helped to develop many security operations centers in the government and industry, and there are organizations constantly knocking at our door and trying to knock it down.
But China would only attack those military websites. They would never go for Healthcare.gov, would they?
Interestingly enough, most organizations, state-sponsored organizations, and I've put this in my testimony, they're always looking for jump points. .gov.mil, period.
So the people in China that are attacking us, is their level of proficiency low, medium, high?
Very high.
So we're well advised to warn the American people that they're going to have information on Healthcare.gov that may be spread across the globe.
You are well advised to warn everybody in the federal government and even in industry that cybersecurity and privacy absolutely needs to be one of your top priorities.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you understanding that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Collins, is recognized for his questions.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I find it's been about 2 months since our last meeting. Mr. Kennedy, welcome back. As one of the last witnesses, I tend to see, there's times people will try to defend the indefensible. And the best way to defend the indefensible is to confuse the issue and muck it up and raise other things. And I've heard and seen some of that today. So I'd like to kind of come back here at the end and remind everyone that all 4 witnesses last time, including the Democrat witness, testified absolutely the website was not secure on October 1st. They testified that absolutely the website was not secure on November 19th. We couldn't get agreement as to whether we should shut it down immediately or not. But the testimony indicated that October 1 was a date certain set by the Obama administration to launch Healthcare.gov, irrespective of whether it was ready. And I think the American public know it was not ready. So I think it brings into question, if it was a date certain, it wasn't let's launch the website when it's ready, let's launch it when it will do the job and handle the traffic, let's launch it when it was secure. No. It was let's launch it on October 1 because we promised it would be October 1. Whether it's ready, whether it's secure, doesn't matter, launch it. And we did. And the American public, in watching this hearing, can see for themselves that that was the overriding concern, certainly not security. So now here we are today, and yes, we have a different witness. But I guess I would ask our witness, Mr. Krush, whether you think the website was ready to be launched on October 1st or not. That's kind of a yes or no.
That's a no.
And do you think it was secure then on October 1st?
So if you've read my testimony and my previous testimony, you'll see that I said the process was followed and a risk-based decision was made. That's why it's called risk management framework and not the no-risk process.
So I guess what I come back to here is, there are those today that tried to say this was a politicized hearing and so forth, which I don't think it is. I think we're just back to talking to the American public who are being told that to sign up they must share this delicate information, including Social Security numbers. I think the fact that Target or Neiman Marcus happen to have had their issues doesn't defend this. Two wrongs don't make a right by any stretch of the imagination. But I'm trying to point out and remind folks, this website was launched on October 1st for only one reason, political reasons. It was not ready. The administration knew it was not ready. If it's not ready, it's not secure. It wasn't secure. We know it wasn't secure. Now we're being told today to trust the administration and Mr. Cruz, to trust some of your judgment. Something's happened in the last week or two or month. It's now secure. Well, I guess I'm not quite ready to accept that just because you say it is so. That doesn't necessarily make it so. I'm just trying to bring us back to where we were October 1, where we were on November 19th, where we are today. And certainly I'm confident three of our witnesses today. Mr. Kennedy, do you think it's secure today?
Absolutely not.
Mr. Grigg?
No, I do not. And usually when sites are rolled out, they're rolled out in a beta first, very small group, and then to a large group.
Mr. Perlman, do you believe it's secure today?
You know, it's hard to tell. I'm not, these people are the experts, but basically, based on what I'm hearing, again, as a citizen of this country, I'm concerned. I'm not happy with what I'm hearing here today.
Okay, and Mr. Cruz, I'll let you answer that as well, please.
I think my testimony and everything I've been saying here is none of us worked on Healthcare.gov, so speculating that it's either secure or not is just not something I'm willing to say.
So you would say today you would not state affirmatively to the American public that it is secure?
Based on the information that I have read, a risk-based decision was made. There was a mitigation strategy that was very clear. They are doing weekly scans. They're doing daily scans. They're doing mitigation, remediation.
Okay, I was kind of hoping for a yes.
That's pretty secure.
So you are stating, yes, it is secure?
I am stating, based on the information I have right now, I would say it's secure.
Okay. Well, we can have that difference of opinion, and I guess I'll leave it at that for the American public to make their own decisions. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. The gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, is recognized for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Crush, unlike some of the other witnesses, you have extensive experience working on federal government websites from the inside, developing countermeasures against potential attacks, and ensuring that websites are as secure as possible. Is it true that what might appear like a security vulnerability or even a successful exploit from the outside does not actually always result in a security threat?
That's correct, Ms. Kelly. Actually, we like to set up things called honeypots, meaning that we'll set up, we want to know what the attackers are actually doing to our websites and our systems. So we set up ports, protocols, and services that may not have anything to do with the website to kind of find out who's coming in, what they're doing, and so that we can then build countermeasures internally to deal with those type of things.
I've also been told that a site security team will leave the appearance of a weakness in place so that hackers will waste their time. At other times, as I understand it, seeming weaknesses are purposely put in place in what IT professional, like you just said, honeypots, where a genuine hacker or even a white hacker gets caught trying to penetrate a system. And you just said that that was true. Do you imagine with Healthcare.gov that honeypots are in place? Or?
So Ms. Kelly, because I didn't set up the honeypot, I can't speculate on that either. But it is a very normal practice and best practice in the government to set up honeypots so that we can understand what our adversaries or external organizations are trying to gain access to and what type of things they're actually doing to our websites.
Okay. And lastly, the Healthcare.gov website uses remote authentication to help verify that the users are who they claim they are in order to help cut down on medical fraud. These sorts of security practices can sometimes make websites clunky and the user interface problematic. Can you address this issue for us? Is it possible that these sorts of kinks and glitches experienced on Healthcare.gov were due to its enhanced security measures by any chance?
The great thing about security is if it's done right, it won't work. No, I'm joking. So a lot of times when we lock down systems in the federal government, if we followed every single security control that's put forward for us, we would turn that box or that system into a completely unusable, lockdown box, meaning I couldn't log into it as an administrator, but neither could you. So what we do is we look at the controls from a security engineering perspective and decide what are the best security controls to implement and how that's going to affect our operational user base. And so to answer your question, that is a possibility, but I didn't actually do the identity management system, so once again, I can't really talk to that fact.
Thank you so much. I yield this my time.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Kelly. I don't see any other members here to ask questions, so this concludes our hearing today. Thank you all again for your contributions to the subject at hand. We heard a lot of good testimony, and we'll continue to be in touch. We stand adjourned.